The goal of this video is to fix the bug that we have with our URL shortener code. And in fact, if we try to navigate to this URL now, we'll see that it doesn't work and it's just missing this stage, right? And if we actually add the stage manually there to work. And this is due to our API gateway deploys our API. It always deploy with a stage. Now, once we move into using our own custom domain, we can map the domain to a particular stage, and so we won't need to say slash whatever that stage is. It would just be your domain slash the resource. So for now, there are some things we can probably do to improve our code. Let's talk about those. And let's go into our code. If we go to the way we're creating our URL, we'll see that we're actually storing the short URL. We probably want to dynamically just return this in the response and not store it in the database, since we can always take the short code and compute it along with the resource with the URL. So probably one of the first things we need to do is to remove this. Also, we need a way to detect which stage. Typically, a stage would be linked to an AWS account, right? You may have your dev account, which you use just to do your development. And once you move into production or testing, that stage variable will change. So one thing we'll do here is maybe treat this version of our code as the dev or let's say QA stage. And once we move into using our own domain, we'll just say change that stage to another variable like prod. And so we can use our code to as that condition to check whichever environment we're running in and compute our URL. So how do we get the stage though? So let's open up CloudFormation. And if you just open any Lambda function, we're just gonna pick create. And if we go into monitor, let's open up CloudWatch logs. And we're just gonna open any log. So if we look at our code, one of the first things we do is we print the event. And that include all the information with our post, request, or response body, request body, and all the other data. So if we probably copy this, and if you open maybe just about any JSON format or JSON prettier tool, we can probably have a much more closer look at this. Let me maximize this. If you look in the request context, right, this is body. We're using body to get the request that's sent in. If we open up request context, there's a ton of additional information. There's the domain name, the API ID, the account, and here it is, our stage. So we can at runtime detect which environment this is running in and then run specific parts of our code. One drawback to this is once a stage is deployed, right, if we try to change that stage on the API, we may get an error, and we will check that in real time. So what we'll probably need to do is update our template. So open up your template YAML, and if we look for our API, right, we'll see that we are statically adding stage as dev. We want to move this to a parameter. So if we go right under transform, we're going to say parameters, and we're going to call this stage name. Can be any value, and it is type string, and we're going to default to dev. Now this, with our parameters, we can inject these values at runtime. For the sake of this demo, just to keep it simple, we're just going to hard code it for now. And let's grab this variable. And if we go all the way down to our API, now we can remove this hard-coded value and replace it with a reference. So there we are. So now at runtime, we'll always get the correct stage. in our code now, what we can do is, since we already identified that the request context, and let's collapse this as a stage, we can check this in our Lambda function and make sure and detect which stage we're running in. So let's open up back our create. And before we compute our short URL, we're going to check which stage we're running in. So if, and let's just store this in a variable right now. So we're going to say stage equals stage equal json.loads. And we're getting this from the event. And let's make sure we're getting the right name. So it's request context. And then stage. So this should give us our stage variable. And now we can check what our stage is. So if our stage is dev, we can add the stage right after our host, else we are in production. So let's say else prod with custom domain. And so we no longer need to pass the stage since we're using our custom domain. And that should be it. So let me go ahead and save this and perform a build and a deploy. Now this may fail, and so we'll take a look at whatever error we get. But there's some caveats around how AWS and CloudFormation SAM template works in terms of how it creates new resources or update resources. There's some resources you can't update with the same value, and you will see how this works in this case. And here we go. So we're getting a failure, and probably the best place to look at this is on the AWS console. So if we go back to CloudFormation and you want to check events, and here we're saying the stage already exists. Now what we're trying to do is we're telling CloudFormation or SAM to create a new stage on our API, but we're setting the stage to the very same name that it is now, and that's where it's failing. What we can probably do is, since we already have a hard-coded dev stage, let's actually change this to non-prod, and we're going to run this. The goal is not so the name of the stage, right? We just want to make sure we're using a parameter for the stage. So let's deploy this. This time we can go ahead. We know exactly what will happen. Stage, you may need to always use a param. You just have a lot more flexibility, especially when updating the stack. Okay, so now that we have that stage in place, we can now set up our stage name parameter to use dev, or any other value we have. We're just going to say dev. And we should be able to use this now as a reference. So let's copy this. And moving forward, now if we want to replace the stage name, we just change the parameter itself instead of the hard-coded value. So let's do a SAM build. And we're going to deploy. And there we go. So the takeaway here is try to use parameters in places where you're hard coding strings. Right, I think there's a lot more flexibility there, and you'll avoid running into issues like this when you're trying to update a resource that's already using a hard coded value. So now that we have our stage in place, our code should be detecting. Again, of course, this is incorrect, right? This should be dev, and I'll deploy that real quick, but that should be it. Just make sure your stage is checking for the correct. And there we go. So let's go ahead and open up Postman. We're going to actually create a new URL, and we are getting an error. So let's try to see. Actually there. So let's go open up CloudWatch, and we are getting a JSON encode. And I think I know where the problem is. So if we look back where we're getting the, let's refresh this. I'm just going to open up this code so we can actually have a quick test on this. If we look at, oh, we're getting the stage, right? We're saying JSON.load events, and we're drilling down. So let's make this a little more clear. So let's take a look at what the error message is. And we're having some JSON encode and error at line 24 in the handler. So pretty much it's screaming where we're getting the stage. So we're doing something wrong right here. So let's go back to our code and see what we're doing. So if we look back at our JSON structure and we look at request context, we can see that this is actually a dictionary already, versus when we got the body, we had to do the encoding with JSON.loads. So we're probably trying to change our JSON structure into JSON again, or into a Python dictionary. So let's actually update our code, since we no longer need to do a JSON.loads. So we should just be able to get the event, since this is already a JSON like this. And that should all we need, and we can probably maybe print match print save this build, and we'll deploy. Okay, so let's go to our Python or Postman, and we're just gonna send this, and there we go. So now we're getting back the stage. Our code works. In our next video, we need to update our code so that every time we click or a user visits that URL, we increment our count by 1. That should be fairly simple. So see you in the next video.